Hello, all. Welcome to today's session. So let's start without any delay. So give me a minute. Yes. Okay. Right. Yeah. Fine. So in previous session, we have learned about what is about this in objects. What is the use of this in methods? What is this in not bound? And how does arrow functions miscalculate or misrepresent, or how does this works in arrow functions altogether? So now coming to this point. In today's session, let's focus on understanding about constructor functions, constructor functions, and also let's focus on understanding about optional chaining. So, with these two things, let's go ahead and implement these fundamental topics, or let's try to understand these different fundamental topics. Now, sorry, sorry, right. So, okay, give me a minute. So, this is how we actually focus and understand the intermediate concepts. So from this session onwards, we are into the intermediate concepts of JavaScript. So yes, let's without any delay, let's go ahead. Let me create a file known as constructor. Let me keep it as very simple. Mm, constructor dot js. Let's do that one single thing. Constructor dot js. Now, yeah. First things first, let's try to understand what is meant by this constructor. What is this constructor function and the things. So under this constructor function concept, we will learn the following. So the first one we'll be learning about is constructor function, whereas the second thing and second most important thing we learn about is operator, a new operator to be more precise. There is operator named as new operator. We try to understand these two things, then we'll go for optional chaining altogether. That's an interesting topic altogether. Now coming back to this definition of constructor function. So I can say um yeah, a regular syntax flower brackets which is flower brackets, this object literal, allows us to create one object to create one object, but often we need to create many such kind of a similar objects. Like, let's say for a given particular website, if you have multiple users at a given point of time, instead of creating a web object using this, what is the easiest way to do it? What is the easiest way to do it? So for that, we'll be requiring this constructor function, and that bulk amount of creating users, or I can say, sorry, menu items, etc., which is in a bulk format. We require we require constructor functions and new operator. These are the two things that we require. First things first, let's try to understand what is meant by this given particular thing known as a constructor function altogether. So specifically, if we can have any kind of a definition, I can say, um, I think constructor function is maybe technically, so for a respective, yeah, for a respective thing in the format of technical terms, constructor function is technically our regular functions, regular functions. But there are two conventions though. So constructor functions are also like regular functions, but there are two differences, I can say. I can say this in this format. They are named with capital letter first. Second thing would be they should be executed with a new operator. So this is the things that is what differentiate a normal function and a constructed function altogether, right? So now one very important thing we also need to understand is, uh, let's see how can we implement these things. So for example, as the function name should start with capital letter, I'll say function user, and I'll simply say this dot name is actually is equal to name. Let me, sorry, keep name here, right? So I'm writing a normal function where I'm passing the parameters. And now let's go back and I'll say this is admin is false. Is admin is false. Now using this function, using this one single constructor function, we can create n number of objects. How can we create? Is creating any number of objects. That's the first and foremost thing that we need to clearly understand. How can we do it? Yeah. So coming back to this given particular thing, let's try to understand how can we do it. So I'll say let user is equal to, whenever, always remember, if you want to call this given particular constructor function, if you want to execute this given particular function, you require new operator. So you'll simply say new user of. So while calling this given particular constructor function, we have an argument. So we have a parameter. So we need to send some kind of a data. So I'll say Nitin. Sorry, Nitin. We have this thing known as a Nitin. This is the constructor function. That's a question we cannot do class declaration. Right. Right. Now if you can say console.log user, let me say node constructor.js. I can clearly see I've just created created an object using one single line. So the same thing I can also do it in this format. So I'll say let user is equal to, let user is equal to name should be Nitin. EZadmin is equal to false. So instead of creating a user like this, a regular format of user like this, what if we have written a constructor function and we can create users like this? We can create users like this. We can create users like this. And one very important thing, if you can clearly observe this constructor function, I have used the keyword named as this because these constructor functions are primarily used to create, I have created a bulk amount of users or menu items if you want to create, because as we can clearly we have seen that if you want to create any kind of a real world entity, if you want to convert a real world entity into the programming code or into your code, we do require the help of objects. So if you want to create more number of users or more number of menu items in a menu card, we consider each of them as in one single entity, one single object altogether. So let's say for a given particular I can say a web page, if you have multiple users, let's say we have 100 users, it's a very bad way to create 100 users in this format. In this format, it's always a good and easiest way. It's always good and easiest way to represent in one single, or to create the users in one single line. Let's say I have created it. I'll say let user one is equal to new user of something known as Akhil. So I have missed it. Wait a minute. User one. Now if I say this thing, sorry, user one. Now you can clearly see we have two different objects that are being created. Now one very important thing we can clearly observe that once the output is appeared, the first thing that we can clearly see this constructor function. So if a given particular object is created, then first in the output we'll see from which constructor function it has been created and what is the data that is present inside that object. So this is how this entire thing will be actually working. Now one very important thing, as we are focusing more in this constructor function to create objects, so here this represent these values, this represent these values. So in this context I can clearly observe this actually equals to the value of user. So in this context, as we have already seen the working nature of this keyword, user one, user one. So it's all about the different users. It's all about different users. So at that given point of time, that's why while this line is getting executed here, when this function is being executed, this value will be changed to user. This Nitin will be replaced here in name. That's how this entire thing actually works. This entire chain of things actually work. But things apart, let's try to dig deep in understanding how this entire statement, this right hand statement is exactly executing. This right hand statement is exactly executing. Let's try to understand it out. Let's keep it like this. So I'll say when a function is executed with new operator. Let me keep this name. With this respective new operator, it does the following steps. First thing is a new empty object is created and assigned to this. This is the first thing actually happens. This is the first step that actually happens while executing this right hand statement. While executing this right hand statement, the first step is a new empty object is created and is assigned to this. That looks like let me write it down. Let me write the steps and let me show you how can we implement the same thing. The second thing is the function body executes usually it modifies this keyword. Wait. Adds new properties to it. And we also need to mention the value of this is returned. The value of keyword this, not this, keyword this. So, in other words, let's try to understand how does this entire thing actually work. Let me write a multi-line comment. So I'll say in other words, we'll say new user does as below. Does as below. Does something like this as below is fine. Everything is fine. I'll say function user name. First things first, what exactly happens is here, according to the first step, empty object will be created. This empty object will be created and will be assigned to a term known as this. A term known as this. Now, second thing, the function body executes. Usually it modifies this, adds properties to it. Adds properties to it. So here, add properties to this. Now, in this respective context, I can say this dot name is equal to name. This dot is admin is equal to false. Now, once this Second step is also done. Then we'll return this. This happens implicitly, which is nothing but this is completely internal thing. This is completely internal thing, and this is also completely internal thing. This is also completely internal thing. So first it creates an empty object. Then once that has been done, whatever names that you pass will be attached here. So now this at this point of time will refer to, let's say in this case it would be user, in this case it would be user1. That's how these two values will be returned, and entire object will be returned. Entire object will be returned. Right? So that's how this entire constructor function will actually work. Now, if you want to create other uses, we can simply call it like this, as we have shown. If you want to create other uses like something like Alice, something like Nikhil, something like Niranjan, all these things can be called like that. So it is very time consuming, and it is also shorter to write, easy to read, time consuming, all these things. So if you ask me the main purpose of this constructor function, let me write it down. Purpose of constructor function is simple. The main purpose of this aspect of constructor function is simple, is to implement reusable reusable object creation code. So technically any function except arrow functions, as they don't work with the keyword this. Technically any function can be a constructor function. It can be run with new operator. It will execute the algorithm above. This algorithm, whatever this I have told, this algorithm. They'll execute the above algorithm. So the one very common agreement that we found is this first letter capital letter. For constructor function, the first letter should be capital. For regular function, it should be small letter. So that why this differentiation is that to make it clear that the function is to be run definitely with new, because always remember, I need to tell this one super important thing. Without new, I mean without new operator, to be more precise. Constructor function can't be executed. This is the first step. Second important thing. With a but with or without new operator, any function can be executed. So if anyone asks the difference between a constructor function and a regular function, any answer regular function, any regular function can be executed. So this is one fundamental thing that we must understand. Now one very important thing is, if you have many lines of code where that entire lines of code is all about, you know, um, uh, it's all about creation of single complex object. Let's say we have 100 lines of code where that 100 lines of code is actually focusing upon creating a single object. Then we can wrap them in an immediately called constructor function. Like, let me give a sample example. Let's say, let's create a function and immediately call it with new. So I'll say let user, let me comment all of it. Let me comment all of it. Let user is equal to new function. And I'll say this dot name is equal to something like some Nitin. This dot is admin is equal to false. And other code for creation, like for user creation to be more precise. User creation like age, the phone number, the email address, or maybe some or complex logic. You can have it complex logic, or sometimes it could be some local variables, etc. Local variables, etc. So one very important thing we need to understand is this constructor, this specific constructor can't be called again because this is not saved anywhere. Here we just created a constructor function. We just created a constructor function because we have this new terminology or the term operator new. So it was just created and called. We cannot recall this thing. We cannot recall this thing. So this trick, while we don't focus on long-term usability, but we just want to call it, create it, and leave it. If you want to go that way, then this trick actually aims to, you know, create one single object by having all the code at one single place without future use. Without future use. That's what this given particular thing of the constructors are being used for. Are being actually used for. Now, um, right. So let's go ahead and understand a few other things. Let's say a return from constructors. Return from constructors. Return from constructors. So as usually there's one statement. Usually constructors do not have a written statement. Do not have a written statement. Their task is to write all the necessary stuff into this. Their task is to write all necessary stuff into this. That's it. And it automatically it automatically becomes the result. It automatically becomes the result. But if there is a written statement, then rule is simple. But if there is a written statement, then the rule is simple, which is I'll say if return is called with an object, then the object returned instead of this. Right. It's not IPG, it's OPG. Instead of this. This means this keyword. Always remember this is a bit confusing when dealing about this keyword. If return is called with primitive like number, string, big int, boolean, symbol, any such kind of a things, it's ignored. It's ignored. In other words, return with an object returns an object. Return with an object returns the object. In all other case, this is returned. In all other case, this will be returned. If you are returning an object, it will return an object. If it is returning a primitive, it returns this. It overrides this and it will gives the object, returning an object. That's how it entirely things happen. So on a simpler level, I'll say function when cta1 big user. I'll say this dot name is equal to something like nothing. I'll simply return an object. I'll say name something like Superman. Sorry, name something like Superman. Now, if you execute it, if I say console.log new big user dot name. If I do such kind of a things, let's see what exactly it will return us. Right now you can clearly see this object is getting returned. So I got Superman as an output. Now let's take a example of function small user. This dot name is actually equal to Nathan, and instead now I'll return some. It's not written this like this. Just kept it, keep the return like this, and I'll say console dot log new small user dot name. Let's see what exactly will be returned. And you see it is returning this entire thing. So here we have our empty return. We could place it with a primitive. I can say return 0. Anything can be fine. Anything can be fine, right? But if you have an empty return, it is also the same fine. It is also the same fine. So um, another important thing I just want to mention is uh, when you are creating a user like this, like let's remove, we can use it like this without parentheses. Even if you can clearly observe in the previous example, I've been consistently focusing on adding this thing, but this parenthesis is not that required. Parenthesis is not that required. That's a fundamental point here. And finally, we need to understand the methods in constructor functions, to be more specific. Let's say let's have this function where it is taking name. This dot name is equal to name that we are going to pass, and this dot say hi is equal to a regular way of writing. You'll simply say console dot log my name is I'll say this dot name. You can write it like this. So similarly, now I need to create just a user, a simple user. I'll say let user is equal to new user. We'll write some names, some name. What is like? Let's try to give some Nathan. I already have user. Oh yeah. I'll simply say console dot log user dot say hi. And I can clearly see that this console log is now being represented, or instead of console log, this console log is not that required. Right. I can clearly see this is how we can create constructors specifically in this is how we can create methods specifically in constructor function altogether. So this constructor function helps us to create complex objects, and there is much more advanced syntax when we going to see this respect to thing known as an oops concept altogether. Now let's go ahead and understand this one fundamental topic which is known as optional chaining. Now, right. So now let's go ahead and understand this one basic concept known as optional chaining. It's a very interesting thing to learn. A very new addition to the language. Let's mention it as like this optional chaining. Optional chaining altogether. Now, what is meant by this thing known as an optional chaining? So it is represented like this question mark dot. The symbol of optional chaining is this. So is the easiest way or not easiest way? I can say safe way. Is a safe way to access nested object properties, even if an intermediate property doesn't exist. So there is this one problem known as non-existing problem. Existing property problem. Property problem. Now, what is this non-existing property problem? For example, let's say whenever we are, to be more precise, let's say when we are actually representing users as an objects in our given particular code, most of the users, while we collect our data and store the respective users data into an object, we have this separate thing known as an address. So we will be having this property known as user dot address, where in that address we might also have this thing known as street. So it would be user dot address dot street. To be more precise, let me explain it to you. I'll say let user is equal to a user where we'll store the respective details. Name is some ABC, age something 25 or 24. Then we have something like address is one such an object because it will be an object, or it should be an object because address, under the address we'll be having street, we'll be having city, not town, city. It's city or from pin code. We'll be having this or not this, specifically address, street, and different details altogether. So whenever we are connecting users data, specifically the address data, we'll collect all of these basic details under this address. If you can clearly observe, user itself, where we are storing, is an object where we are storing entire data of users. But inside that we have a nested object known as address, where inside this nested object address we have different properties: street, city, pin code, and so different kind of things. Now, one very important thing we need to understand is it's not the case. Let me write. It's not every time the user provides us with data, with the data of the address. So some users are not willing to provide this given particular data. Some will actually provide, but some will not provide this respective data for us, right? Now, in such case, when users are not giving the address data, in such case, if sorry, if we try to do something like uh, this, something like this. So let me give an example. Let's say if user is equal to something like empty object. He hasn't given any kind of a thing. For example, like the name should be something like Nathan or some other thing. Age 23, and that's it. He hasn't given any kind of other details. He just gave email and phone. Email. Uh, email. He has given some abc at the rate gmail.com. Mobile. It would be something like some number, but he hasn't given any kind of an address data. Now in such case, when you try to find out this one single thing, if you want to get user dot address dot street, and if you try to run the code, you'll see there is an error, type error. What it is mentioned, cannot read the properties of undefined, cannot read the properties of undefined. So what exactly here the thing is, let me go, is there any other thing? Let's comment it down. Let's rerun the code. Let me check. Yes, we are still getting the error. Cannot read the properties of undefined. One very important thing we need to understand is here we got a type error because under user, we don't have anything known as an address. We don't have this property known as address. So uh, for address property, the value associated would be what we call undefined. Value could be undefined. So if this address property is holding the value of undefined, if someone tries to do this kind of a thing, undefined dot street, because undefined dot street, this is what the error is actually happening. So if someone is trying to read undefined, because undefined itself is an undefined, it's nothing, there is nothing. If you're trying to read this thing, then we might hit this given particular errors, right? Now one very important thing we need to understand is, how do we solve it? How do we solve it? The obvious solution would be, let me close this off. I'll simply say, um, let's use conditional operator or if statement altogether, the proper if statements altogether. So in such case, I'll simply say console.log user.address question mark. If this user.address is true value, then what I'll be doing, user.address dot street. Otherwise, I'll simply say undefined. Otherwise, I'll say undefined. Instead of writing it, let's write it. Huh? This is one thing. Actually, this works. This works. There is no error. But this is quite inelegant. As you can clearly see, in this one single statement, user.address appears twice. User.address appears twice. So this is not a good style of writing the code because we are repeating ourselves. We should not repeat ourselves, right? So this is not a good thing. Another important thing is I want to mention, for more deeply nested properties, it or above syntax becomes ugly or uglier, to be more precise. Ugly or uglier. The above syntax. This above syntax. So instead, what we can do is we can go ahead with this. We can implement using and operator. And operator. I'll simply say this console.log. I'll say user.address the brand user.address dot street, and if I can go to a next level, I'll say street dot user dot address dot street dot name name. We can go to till this given particular point, right? So this itself is not that proper. Why? Because let me write it. So anding anding the whole path to the property ensures all components exist. All components exist. But this is also not ideal. And you can clearly see the property names are still getting duplicated. User.address, user.address, user address street are getting repeated. So this is also not a good or elegant way of writing the code. Then we have this given particular property known as, where it is. Then we have this respective thing known as an optional chaining. Optional chaining. So this optional chaining stops the evaluation if the value before this symbol, is undefined or null and returns undefined. What does it do? It stops the evaluation if the value before the symbol is undefined or null. Undefined or null. Right. Now, yeah, undefined null. Uh, and returns. If it is the value and returns undefined. Returns undefined. So I can say, right, if this value dot props, for example, let's say this is, or this is not props, this is property prop. If the above uh, value dot prop works, value, I mean, wait a minute, instead of writing like this, what I can do? Um, you can say this works as value dot prop if value exists. If value exists. So otherwise, if that's not the case, otherwise, when value is undefined or null, it returns undefined. This is the basic step. So whatever things that are present below this thing, this value, if it exactly presents, then this entire statement will work. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Otherwise, this doesn't work. For example, let's say let user is equal to thing. Sorry, there's already user named. Okay, let's simple. And if I simply say console log user question mark dot address, then question mark dot street. So if this user is a proper value that already existed, then right, if user exists with, see, when I am telling user exists, where user will be storing something, not undefined and null. I'm saying if user exists, I'm telling that user is actually storing some data, some data. That data could be anything, but not null or undefined. So if user exists, then only user dot address will work. Will work, right? Similarly, if address exists, then only user dot address dot street will be executed. Will be executed. So in this given particular case, here user exists, but in the user we don't have address property. In the user object we don't have address property because user is a empty object. So here we get the value as undefined. So the result would also be for this respective thing as undefined. Undefined. So similarly, if user is something like null, in the first place itself user is something like null. Still here user doesn't exist anymore. So this entire comparison would never work. And another important thing I just want to mention is do not overuse like it. Do not overuse like it. So if you use, let's say, for once, like this, for once, it is fine. Or even you can say, let's say instead of null, let me keep it like this. Right. At least in this given particular context, this is completely fine. This is completely fine because we are using this optional check for one time, but do not overuse it. Do not overuse it at all. So the simple fundamental is before this symbol, before this symbol, before this question mark dot symbol, whatever variable that we have, whatever variable that we have, that must be declared. That must be declared. That must be declared. Right? So here user dot address will work. User dot will address will work. Now this is about respect to optional chaining altogether. This is respect about respect to optional chaining altogether. Now, let me say there are a few other symbols, two more symbols that I have left without. Um, I'll say let user admin is actually equal to something like admin, and I'll say console.log I am admin. And I'll say let user guest is equal to um, empty object. User guest is equal to empty object. I'll say user admin question mark dot, sorry, not question mark dot admin, right? And there is this thing known as user guest dot admin question mark of this. Now, what exactly are these things? So here, let me explain it. Question mark dot this flower braces is used to call a function that may not exist. So for example, if you can clearly observe, here we have two objects. Here we have two objects. First object is user admin where it has some kind of a method. In the second object, we have an empty object. We have an empty object. Now if you can clearly observe, if you can clearly observe, if I say console.log user admin, not user admin, user guest dot admin function. Let's copy, let's stuck it. If I call this thing, let's run the code. I can clearly see there is an error, type error, because it is clearly telling in this user guest object, we don't have a function. We don't have a method. We don't have a method. So it's kind of an error. But if you want to avoid this kind of an error, if you want to avoid this kind of an error, use this given particular statement. Use this given particular statement where in this clear statement, it is clearly trying in user guest, if there is a presence of admin function, then only execute, otherwise leave it. Then only execute, otherwise leave it. That's what this given particular, sorry. That's what this given particular question mark dot thing. So you can clearly see there is no error because here we are clearly mentioning if there is a presence of admin function or admin method inside this user guest object, then only execute this function. Then only execute this function. Otherwise, leave it. So same thing I'm doing for user admin also. Because in user admin, we have this respective thing. Because in user admin, I'm checking if user admin object has admin method, then only execute it. Now I'll repeat it out. It's it. Right now you can clearly see I am admin. I am admin. So this is how we actually use this respective things. Use this respective different things altogether. So coming till this given particular point, yeah. So that's it for this respective session. We'll meet in tomorrow's session altogether. Thank you all.